Then on March 19, 1982, an eruption melted an ice pack that had accumulated in the crater. The waters mixed with loose material on the slopes of the mountains, creating an enormous mud flow. In 9 hours, while no one watched, overnight, the mud flow carved an integrated system of drainages over much of the valley and reopened the way to the Pacific. The drainages included at least 3 canyons 100 feet deep. One was nicknamed the Little Grand Canyon of the Toutle because it's a 1/40th scale model of the real Grand Canyon. See, the mud flowed across, stopped the river from flowing, lakes backed up behind it. Once they got going over the top, it cut through the relatively soft mud, just 22 months old, hadn't completely turned to stone yet, cut through that stuff like a knife through butter. It carved it out. Canyons eroded quickly. Here you can see a picture of the canyon, 1,000 feet wide, 140 feet deep, carved in 9 hours, probably less than 9 hours. You know, you go to bed at night, you wake up in the morning, it's there. At the bottom of that canyon is a little tiny river flowing through there called the Toutle River. I would call it a creek, but they call it a river over there. Once water starts going over a dam, erosion can take place very quickly. Any farmer can tell you that if he's ever built a dam to water his cows, and the water went over the top of the, overflowed the dam, it washed out. We have a demo we do at our Dinosaur Adventureland that shows the same thing, how water can erode quickly. This is the Little Grand Canyon picture here from Lumpkin, Georgia, near Columbus. They built a house up there, built a shed, I think is how it started, and the guy didn't put gutters on, and water came running off the shed and started eroding this little hillside back in the 1800s. Now it's a huge state park with acres and acres and acres of erosion that all started just in the last 200 years. Well, Mount St. Helens has the same thing. There are canyons there, miniature Grand Canyons that formed just in a few hours. Here's some people standing on top of the cliff looking down into this canyon. If you go down in, you can see the sides of it have layers. It's stratified into layers. This had to form very quickly. All the mud washed in there at one time. The canyon was carved out at one time. It does not take a long time for this to happen. Here you can see the very fine strata here of these layers. You can get the same thing with a jar of dirt and water. You shake it up and set it down, it settles into layers in a hurry. It doesn't take long. And at the bottom of this Grand Canyon near where the Toutle River goes, there's a little river called the Toutle River. And if you think that little river made that canyon, you're mistaken. And if you think the Colorado River made Grand Canyon, you're just as mistaken. It had to form quickly as the floodwater ran off. So when the textbook says millions of years, they're confused or they're lying. Now, Mount St. Helens also blew a lot of trees down. About 150 square miles was flattened. I mean, millions of trees were blown down. And they went in to haul out these trees to salvage what they could. Trees floated down the rivers. Here you can see some semi-trucks, buried in these massive logs out there. And if you've never seen the trees in Washington and Oregon, you don't know what a real tree is. I mean, they get huge out there out west. They hauled out as many trees as they could. I mean, millions of trees were hauled out to use for firewood and for lumber. But many of the trees were blown into Spirit Lake, which is just on the north side of the volcano. These trees, you can see them in the picture, floating across the lake, 2,000 acres, about 3 square miles of trees floating on Spirit Lake. They're still there today, many of them. Now, thousands of them have gotten waterlogged and sunk to the bottom. But generally, they would sink root end first. Not always, but they would sink root end first, and they would sink by species. I mean, the Douglas fir would sink one year, the pines would sink a different year. The species separation was interesting because as they sink, then new layers of mud wash in on top, and it's going to look like the forests grew down there at the bottom. None of them grew there. These were rafted in and dropped off as they got waterlogged and sank. Here you can see an upright floater, floating in the upright position. Scientists estimate there are 20,000 trees stuck in the bottom of the mud at Spirit Lake right now. None of them grew there, and they're already over 15 feet deep in sediments from subsequent things washing in around off the shore. Well, during Noah's flood, you would get trees by the bazillions covered up, some in the standing position, and they would get sediments forming around them very rapidly. All over the world, petrified trees are found in the vertical position, petrified standing up. We cover much more on that on videotape number 4, about the petrified trees in the vertical position. And if a tree petrifies standing up and then later the dirt washes away from it, the petrified tree is going to fall over and it's going to break up into logs. I don't know if you ever cut a tree down for firewood or not, but when you cut a tree down, it does not break up into logs for you automatically. You got to saw it up with your chainsaw. Well, yet, if you look at the petrified forests in Calistoga, California, or Flora, Mississippi, or all over Arizona, or central Texas, you find these petrified logs broken up as if it petrified standing and then fell over. I think the flood's the only way to explain that. Well, scuba divers went in under these log mats in Mount St. Helens in Spirit Lake, And they could see the logs are bouncing back and forth against each other, and it rolled all the bark off very quickly. All this bark settled to the bottom, made a thick layer of bark at the bottom, about 3 feet thick. That's going to turn to coal under the right conditions. Textbooks say it takes millions of years to coal to form. No, it doesn't either. Coal can be formed in a few hours in the laboratory. It doesn't take long. You get the right temperature, the right pressure, you can turn organic material into coal in a hurry. This picture shows a floating log mat model from Stephen Austin at ICR. I recommend his work tremendously, incredibly well done stuff on the coal formation. He thinks during the flood, and I agree, there were huge log mats floating back and forth across the ocean. You'd get acres and acres of trees uprooted, floating back and forth, and as they float along, they drop off and leave a debris trail. As they float across, then pretty soon mud washes in, then they float back a few weeks later, and another layer of coal is going to form on top. The layers of coal that we see in the world are indication of a flood. Oftentimes, they dig down, hit a layer of coal, dig down some more, hit rock, and then dig down some more, and hit more coal. I was just in West Virginia a couple weeks ago, and you can fly over West Virginia and see the coal mines that they have. Layer after layer of coal. They dig down, hit the coal, dig down a little more, hit dirt, and then more coal. Multiple layering is best explained by the flood. Now, I debated Jeannie Scott from Berkeley, California, and she said there are 80 separate layers of coal in the Midwest. She's right. She said if you look at all the coal in the world, all the plants of the world today would not form that much fossil fuel. She's right. In other words, there's more coal in the ground now than there are trees to produce it. Here's a big chunk of coal from our museum. There is so much coal in the ground, if you took every bush and plant and tree and blade of grass in the world, you could not form all the coal that's found in the ground. She's right. There is an enormous amount of coal down there. Where'd it come from? She said it took millions of years to form all this coal. No, Jeannie. It took a big flood, and you got to consider that the world before the flood was different. It was mostly covered with land and plants. The Bible says there were plants over the whole earth. Today, the earth is 70% underwater. Only 3% of the earth is habitable for mankind. So she's looking at the world today, assuming that's how it's always been. Now, the Bible warned us about those scoffers that would say, you know, the way things are happening today is the way they've always been, 2 Peter chapter 3. But she's wrong about it taking millions of years to form the coal. It took one big flood and a very different world to get flooded. The pre-flood world was a lot different. There's a coal mine in Montana, 10,000 square miles of coal up to 200 feet thick. Sometimes in the ceiling of the coal mines, they find dinosaur tracks. Hundreds of them. How do you explain this? Well, during the flood, you'd get log mats laid down and the dinosaurs are walking on top of it. And then later they drown. Another layer of mud washes in and fills in their footprints. And as they dig out the coal, they discover the footprints stuck in the ceiling. They were walking around in the floating in the debris trail left behind by this stuff. Here's a bunch of tracks. You can see the picture here. These are all footprints in the ceiling of coal mines. In central Alabama, there's a large coal mine. They find petrified trees standing up. A friend of mine works up there in the mine. He said oftentimes they find layers of coal that are separated, and pretty soon they come together. It's called lensing. Now, they're telling us that these coal layers are different ages. It's just simply not true. The coal layers and the mud layers all form simultaneously, just like with this thing. You can flip it around back and forth, and you can see little lenses form in here. Sometimes they are layers of rock, layers of dark in between layers of white, and the white comes together. Formations in Wyoming, oftentimes the textbooks say it took millions of years to form the Green River Formation. When they dig down through the Green River Formation, they find different numbers of layers between different areas. We cover all that on video number 7. It did not take a long time to form that. It took a big flood. Now, sometimes in coal, human artifacts are found, like this bell found inside a lump of coal in West Virginia, or this zinc and silver vessel found in solid rock in Massachusetts. Textbook says this is 600 million year old rock. No, it's not. In 1891, they found a gold chain inside a lump of coal back in Illinois. A carved stone was found inside a lump of coal in Iowa. Here's an iron pot. There's a model of it right here on the table. This is a casting of the iron pot found inside a lump of coal in Oklahoma. The real one's in Carl Baugh's museum in Glen Rose, Texas. The sole of a shoe was found inside a lump of coal. There's an article about it right here. And they said the rock was 213 million years old. Now, coal formed during that flood in the days of Noah. The Bible says in Genesis 8, the waters assuaged. They dropped down, they sank down. And then it says the water was going and returning. It returned from off the earth continually. The Hebrew phrase here in Genesis 8 is the going and returning, halak vashab. The water was going and returning. Well, if you get sections of the earth that sink down, the water's going to rush in and then slosh back and forth, probably for weeks. as the energy gets dissipated. This is the best way to explain the horizontal bedding plains that we see, the mud layers settling out flat, and then folding up as the mountains arose and the valleys sank down, and then getting washed off by subsequent erosion, and then new layers being put on top. These places are called unconformities in geology. The bottom of Grand Canyon has a huge one. I think the flood's the best explanation for all this, not millions of years of slow, gradual accumulation. The Bible says the ark rested in the 7th month. Now Noah didn't get out till the 13th month. If you read through Genesis, you'll see God told him to go in the ark, told him when to go out of the ark. He was in there for over about 12 and a half months. But it rested in the 7th month. Why would he stay in there the extra 5.5 months after the ark hit bottom? If Noah's ark is indeed 17 miles from the main Mount Ararat, then we have a piece of it. This is a piece of the formation that Ron Wyatt thinks is Noah's ark. So that might be a piece of the ark, I don't know. But why would he stay in there for all that extra time? Why not get out? Well, for one reason, the water was still going back and forth. It wasn't safe to get out yet. Maybe that's why some of the anchor stones are found several miles from where the ark is. They might have cut the ropes loose, and then another wave comes back, lifts them up, and moves them inland a few miles, sets them down again. So that may be a reason for the separation there. Plus, the ground is still muddy outside, and there's nothing to eat outside and nothing to build with. It would take a while for things to grow again. Seeds that floated around in the flood would tend to regerminate and start to grow afterwards, and you end up 5 months later, now it's time to get out. There's stuff to eat outside. The Bible says in the 10th month, the tops of the mountains were seen. So here's the Hovind theory. Over the next few years, 100 years actually, the ice caps slowly melted back. This makes the oceans larger, the continents smaller. It gives us a continental shelf, and cold water stores carbon dioxide. Hot water won't store it. That's why when your soda pop gets warm, it loses its fizz. If the oceans are getting colder, they're going to draw CO2 out of the atmosphere, and that's what plants use. That's one of the greenhouse gases, and that's going to allow more radiation to get in. As the CO2 is absorbed, now more radiation gets in and shortens lifespans in the days of Peleg. As the ice caps melt, the people are spreading out around the world, and they end up getting trapped. You got a couple of 100 years to spread from the Tower of Babel to spread all over the world. In a few hundred years, they could walk anywhere. And then they ended up getting trapped as the ice caps melted back and the oceans filled in. There's a good book about the spreading of the populations after the flood called Noah to Abram, the Turbulent Years. You can order that through our bookstore. So my explanation is, the Hovind theory is, the ice caps were smaller, they melted back, leaving behind the drumlins, the terminal moraines, and all the ice age effects that we see today. And by the time you get to the days of Peleg, 200 years later, most of this is done. Ice caps, people are divided. The earth is divided. The Bible says in the days of Peleg, the earth was divided. Now, there are several theories what that means. One theory says the languages and nations were divided in the days of Peleg. The Tower of Babel incident took place. We don't know the date for that, but because it was a different one of Noah's sons that the genealogies figured through. Second theory says the continents moved. I don't buy that one, because if you move a continent, 20 feet, you're going to kill everybody. Just from the earthquakes it's going to generate. Some people think the water came up and divided the continents. I think that's a logical theory. As the ice melts back, the water comes up, and things that used to be hills and valleys are now islands. And they're separated. Fourth theory is the land was surveyed. A few hundred years after the flood, they'd have so many people by now, they're going to start arguing and say, hey, wait a minute, that's my property. Let's draw a line right here. Let's divide the land, and we'll put a few markers out here, and this is my yard, that's your yard. Divide it up. Eventually, that's going to have to happen. I don't know. But the ice caps melting back explains a lot of things. The continental shelf, the colder oceans, and the shortened lifespans. As the Atlantic Ocean filled in after the flood, from the ice caps melting back, it would get deeper. Pretty soon it starts to spill over right by Spain. And it would carve out the straits that we see there. As the water filled in, it would fill in part of the Mediterranean. The western Mediterranean was filled in probably 100 years after the flood. Then it got deeper and it spilled over by Sicily and filled in the eastern Mediterranean. They're finding underwater along the coast of Egypt and several other places in the world, they're finding cities that are underwater. Why would somebody build a city underwater? Well, they didn't build it underwater. They built the city, and then the water came up, probably a few hundred years after the flood, from the melting ice caps. Then it finally spilled backwards into the Black Sea. There were big articles in the paper a couple years ago about they discovered Noah's flood because they found cities 150 feet underwater in the Black Sea. That's not Noah's flood. That's probably from a result of Noah's flood. But these cities under 150 feet of water are probably from post-flood times.